The fluorescent lights of the trauma center at St. Ives Memorial Hospital hummed with a frequency that most people couldn't hear, but for Ada, the sound was a constant, drilling reminder of where she was. At 27, with skin the color of deep mahogany and a stillness that unnerved the casual observer, she moved through the sterile corridors like a ghost. She wore the standard-issue blue scrubs of a junior trauma nurse, a uniform that seemed to render her invisible to the high-status residents and attendings who strutted through the halls. To them, she was just part of the furniture, a pair of hands to hold a retractor or mop up a spill, someone who had likely scraped by in community college and was lucky to be allowed inside the sliding glass doors of the city's most prestigious private hospital. They didn't notice the way her eyes constantly scanned the exits, or the way she instinctively checked the structural density of the walls when she entered a room. They only saw the slight tremor in her left hand, a rhythmic twitch she usually hid in her pocket, and labeled it as nervousness. It wasn't nervousness. It was the residual echo of a high-velocity impact from a life she had buried under 3 layers of redacted government files. Dr. Sterling, the chief attending of the night shift, was the primary architect of her daily humiliation. Sterling was a man who had been sculpted by Ivy League rowing teams and family money, possessing a jawline that could cut glass and an ego that consumed all the oxygen in the room. He leaned against the nurse's station, twirling a gold-plated pen, holding court with a gaggle of sycophantic residents. When Ada walked by carrying a tray of sterilized instruments, Sterling didn't even turn his head, but his voice projected clearly enough for everyone to hear. "Careful with that tray, Ada," he drawled, a smirk playing on his lips. "Try not to let the shakes drop a $10,000 set of forceps. We don't have the budget to cover clumsy mistakes tonight." The residents snickered, a chorus of enablers desperate for his approval. Ada didn't flinch. She didn't stop walking. She simply adjusted her grip, her face a mask of absolute neutrality, and continued toward Trauma Bay 1. In her mind, she was calculating the distance between Sterling's carotid artery and the pen in his hand, a reflex she couldn't turn off, but outwardly she was just the quiet, trembling nurse who knew her place. The break room was a suffocating box of stale coffee and passive aggression, a place Ada usually avoided, but protocol demanded she take her 15-minute rest. She sat in the far corner, her back to the wall, never to the door, nursing a bottle of water. The other nurses, a clique led by a sharp-tongued woman named Brenda, were clustered around a smartphone, laughing at a video. Occasionally their eyes would dart toward Ada, their whispers loud enough to carry across the linoleum. They mocked her silence, her lack of social engagement, and the way she refused to gossip about the doctors. "She's like a statue," Brenda whispered, rolling her eyes. I asked her about her weekend, and she just said, "Quiet. Who talks like that? It's creepy. Sterling says she probably washed out of some terrifying militant boarding school." They laughed again, finding comfort in their shared cruelty. Ada stared at the water in her bottle, watching the liquid settle. She wasn't offended. Offense required valuing their opinion. She was just biding her time, waiting for the shift to end so she could return to the solitude of her apartment where the noise of the world couldn't reach her. But the silence of the night was shattered by the harsh, rhythmic blare of the red phone, the direct line to emergency dispatch that signaled a catastrophic incoming case. The atmosphere in the break room shifted instantly from mockery to panic. The intercom crackled to life, the voice on the other end breathless and strained. "Code Black, multiple GSWs, high-value target incoming. ETA 2 minutes. Police escort is negative, private security only." The words code black sent a jolt of adrenaline through the staff. It meant unchecked violence, potential threats to the hospital itself, and a patient whose survival was a matter of political or criminal necessity. Brenda dropped her phone. The other nurses looked at each other with wide, fearful eyes. Ada stood up. She didn't rush. She didn't gasp. She capped her water bottle, placed it on the table, and walked out of the break room with a stride that was suddenly different, smoother, grounded, predatory. In the hallway, Dr. Sterling was already shouting orders, his voice pitched an octave higher than usual, the smooth veneer of the confident doctor cracking under the pressure of a genuine crisis. Get the trauma team. Prepare O negative. Call security. Tell them to lock down the lobby. He was flailing, waving his arms at people who were already moving. Ada passed him, her eyes locked on the bay doors, her mind already shifting gears from civilian dormancy to operational readiness. The arrival was not a medical transfer, it was an invasion. The double doors of the ambulance bay didn't just open, they were kicked wide by men in dark, blood-splattered suits. The roar of a high-performance engine idled aggressively outside. The chop of a helicopter rotor beat the air somewhere in the distance. 3 men entered first, moving in a tight phalanx, weapons drawn, but held low against their tailored blazers. They were Korean, their faces hard masks of disciplined fury, scanning the room for threats. In the center of their formation, carried on a stretcher that looked too fragile for the chaos, was the patient, Jae-sun, even covered in blood, with a complexion turning the color of ash. The man possessed a magnetic, terrifying beauty. He was 35, built with the lean, dangerous musculature of a fighter, his expensive silk shirt torn open to reveal a jagged, dark hole just below his ribcage. He was conscious, barely, his eyes specifically focused, fighting the pull of shock. The lead bodyguard, a massive man with a scar running through his eyebrow, shouted in Korean, his voice booming off the tiled walls. "Doctor, now! No police, no police!" Sterling froze. The sight of the guns, the sheer intensity of the violence that had just rolled into his pristine ER, paralyzed him. He was a creature of boardrooms and golf courses, not gangland warfare. He took a step back, his hands raising instinctively in surrender rather than medical readiness. The nurses scattered, cowering behind the central station. The monitors on the stretcher were screaming alarms. Blood pressure critical, heart rate thready and erratic. The bodyguard grabbed Sterling by the lapels of his white coat, dragging him toward the stretcher, shouting in broken English, "Fix him! You fix him now!" Sterling stammered, his hands shaking violently, far worse than Ada's ever had. I need him prepped. I need anesthesia. We can't... The guns. Put the guns away." The patient, Jae-sun, let out a low groan, his hand gripping the rail of the stretcher so hard his knuckles turned white. He looked at Sterling with pure contempt, even as his life was bleeding out onto the floor. Ada watched the scene from the perimeter, her eyes narrowing. She saw what Sterling missed. She saw the dark, venous blood pooling near the clavicle, not just the abdominal wound. She saw the way Jae-sun's breath was hitching, a tension pneumothorax building, ready to crush his heart. The chaos in the room spiraled as the monitors flatlined for a terrifying second before picking up a chaotic, dying rhythm. "He's coding!" Brenda shrieked from behind the desk. Sterling was hyperventilating, trying to listen to the patient's chest with a stethoscope that he couldn't keep steady. "I can't get a reading. Too much noise. Everyone shut up," Sterling yelled, panic stripping away his dignity. "He's gone into shock. Push epinephrine. Get the crash cart." He was treating the symptoms, not the cause. He was following a textbook algorithm for a cardiac arrest, unaware that the mechanics of the injury were physical, hydraulic. The lead bodyguard clicked the safety off his weapon, the sound loud and unmistakable in the small room. "Save him," the man growled, the barrel leveling at Sterling's chest. Sterling's bladder released. A dark stain spread across his scrubs. He was going to let the patient die, because he was too terrified to think. Ada moved. It wasn't a walk. It was a tactical breach. She covered the 20 feet between the wall and the stretcher in 2 seconds, moving inside the guard's weapon arc before he could register her presence. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't look at Sterling. She stepped directly into the kill zone, her hip checking the lead bodyguard back with a surprising dense force that made him stumble. "Clear," she said. Her voice was unrecognizable. It wasn't the soft whisper of the break room. It was a command frequency, low, gravelly, and absolute. She reached past Sterling, shoving the doctor aside with one arm as if he were made of straw. Sterling stumbled back, gasping. "What are you doing? You're fired. Get away from him." Ada ignored him. She ripped the remaining buttons of Jason's shirt open. She didn't reach for the crash cart. She reached into her own pocket and pulled out a heavy-gauge decompression needle she had palmed from supply hours ago, a habit she couldn't break. "Tension pneumothorax, right side," Ada announced, not to the doctor but to the air, stating the reality of the battlefield. She palpated Jason's chest, her fingers finding the second intercostal space instantly. There was no tremor in her hand now. Her hands were made of stone and steel. She drove the needle into Jason's chest with a violent, precise thrust. The sound was audible, a hiss of escaping air, like a tire depressurizing. Immediately the monitors changed their tone. The frantic beeping slowed. The oxygen saturation numbers began to climb. Jason gasped, a massive intake of air flooding his starving lungs. His eyes flew open, wild and unfocused at first, then locking onto the face hovering above him. He saw Ada. He didn't see a nurse. He saw the cold, detached focus of a soldier. He saw the sweat on her brow and the total lack of fear in her dark eyes. Sterling, recovering his wits, now that the immediate threat of death had receded, lunged forward. "What the hell do you think you're doing? You just performed an invasive procedure without authorization. That is assault. That is malpractice." He looked at the bodyguards, trying to regain his authority. "She could have killed him. I was about to stabilize the airway." The lead bodyguard looked from the panting, living boss to the trembling doctor, and then to the nurse, who was calmly taping the needle in place. Ada didn't look at Sterling. She looked at the bodyguard. She spoke a phrase in fluent, clipped Korean, a dialect specific to the northern border regions, a language of negotiation and threat. "The lung is clear. The bleed is abdominal. If you want him to live, keep the fool quiet." The room went dead silent. The bodyguard's eyes widened. He lowered his weapon slowly. Sterling looked around, confused, not understanding the words, but feeling the power shift. What did she say? Ada turned her attention back to Jason. He was watching her with an intensity that burned. The pain was washing over him, but he ignored it. He reached out, his hand bloody and shaking, and grabbed Ada's wrist. It wasn't an aggressive grip. It was an anchor. He looked at the needle in his chest, then up at her. Slowly, painfully, he raised his other hand to his brow. It wasn't a wave. It was a salute. A loose, exhausted, but unmistakable military salute. "Who?" Jason rasped, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. "Who are you?" Ada didn't answer. She gently pulled his hand down to his side. "Save your breath," she said, her voice dropping back to a quiet, professional tone, though the command edge remained. "You're not dead yet. Don't make me do paperwork." She looked up at Sterling, who was gaping at the interaction. "Doctor," she said, the title dripping with irony, "the patient is stabilized for transport to the OR. Are you going to scrub in, or are you going to keep wetting your pants?" The humiliation was total. The residents stared, the bodyguard smirked, and on the stretcher, the wounded king of the soul underworld kept his eyes fixed on the nurse who had just declared war on the status quo. The administrative backlash was swift, bureaucratic, and completely detached from the reality of the blood drying on the floor. Within minutes of Jason's stabilization, the hospital's risk management officer, a severe woman named Mrs. Halloway, who viewed patients as liabilities rather than people, marched into the trauma bay, flanked by 2 uniformed security guards. Dr. Sterling, having recovered his voice, if not his dignity, was already spinning the narrative. He pointed a shaking finger at Ada, who was currently adjusting the flow rate on Jason's IV with a calm precision that infuriated him. "She assaulted a patient," Sterling lied, his voice pitching up with righteous indignation. "She performed a needle thoracostomy without an order, without a license, and frankly, without the mental stability required for this environment. I want her removed. I want her arrested." Halloway nodded, her face pinching. "Ada, step away from the patient immediately," she commanded. "Surrender your badge. Security will escort you out. We will be filing a report with the nursing board in the morning." Ada didn't move. She didn't look at Halloway. She looked at the cardiac monitor, watching the sinus rhythm stabilize. Her hand brushed against Jasun's forearm, checking his temperature, a touch that lingered a fraction of a second longer than clinical necessity required. The connection was electric, a silent communication between 2 predators in a room full of prey. Jason, whose eyes had been closed, snapped them open the moment the security guard reached for Ada's shoulder. The movement was a blur. Despite the tube in his chest and the massive blood loss, Jason's hand shot out, gripping the guard's wrist with a crushing force that dropped the man to his knees. The lead bodyguard, who had been silently observing the political theater, stepped forward, his weapon no longer lowered. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with the promise of violence. "She stays," Jason rasped. His voice was weak, but the authority in it was absolute. He turned his head slowly to look at Sterling, his dark eyes filled with a cold, lethal amusement. "You," he whispered, pointing at the doctor. "You shook. You were going to let me drown in my own blood." He turned his gaze back to Ada, his expression softening into something complex, gratitude mixed with intense curiosity. "She did not shake. She is the only reason I am breathing." He looked at Halloway. "If she leaves this room, my men will burn this building down, with you inside it." The threat wasn't screamed. It was stated like a weather report. Halloway paled, clutching her clipboard. The dynamic had shifted irreversibly. The hierarchy of the hospital, doctors above nurses, admin above everyone, had been shattered by the hierarchy of the street, competence above everything. Ada finally looked at Sterling, her expression unreadable. "He needs a surgeon, Sterling, not a politician. Go scrub in or get out of my way." The standoff was broken not by an apology, but by a sound that Ada had been anticipating since the ambulance doors first opened. It was a subtle noise, lost under the hum of the ventilation and the beeping of monitors for everyone else, but for her it was a thunderclap. The distinct thwip hiss of a suppressed round impacting glass down the hallway, followed by the heavy, muffled thud of a body hitting the floor. The lobby security had just been neutralized. The police escort that hadn't arrived wasn't negligence. It was a setup. The rival faction had arrived to finish what they started. Ada's posture changed instantly. The nurse vanished. The operative emerged. She snapped her head toward the lead bodyguard. "Kill the lights," she ordered. "Now!" Before Sterling could protest the insanity of the command, the bodyguard obeyed. He slammed the butt of his pistol into the wall switch, plunging the trauma bay into darkness, illuminated only by the red emergency LEDs and the glow of the vitals monitor. Panic erupted. The residents screamed. Holloway dropped to the floor. "They're here," Ada said, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the hysteria. She moved to the crash cart, not for medicine, but for tools. She grabbed a scalpel, a heavy oxygen tank, and a roll of industrial medical tape. "Sterling, get on the floor and shut up. If you make a sound, you die." She looked at Jason. The Mafia boss was already trying to sit up, wincing as the chest tube pulled. "Stay down," she told him, her hand pressing firmly on his uninjured shoulder. "You've done enough. It's my turn." The double doors at the end of the corridor blew open, not with a kick, but with a controlled breach charge that shook dust from the ceiling tiles. 3 men entered, wearing tactical gear that was far too expensive for street thugs. They moved with professional spacing, their weapons equipped with laser sights that cut through the gloom like red vipers. They weren't here to negotiate. They were a cleanup crew. Ada analyzed their movement patterns in a heartbeat. Mercenaries, ex-military, efficient but overconfident. They expected to find a helpless patient and a terrified medical staff. They didn't know that Trauma Bay 1 had just become a kill box designed by a woman who used to ghost through hostile borders for a living. Ada moved into the shadows behind the supply rack. She breathed out, slowing her heart rate until she was a void in the darkness. She watched the lead mercenary step over the cowering form of a nurse, his weapon scanning the room. He saw Jason's stretcher. He raised his rifle. Ada didn't hesitate. She rolled the heavy oxygen cylinder across the floor with perfect timing. It clattered loudly against the metal legs of a gurney. The mercenary turned, distracted by the noise. In that split second, Ada launched herself from the darkness. She didn't strike like a brawler. She struck like a scalpel. She drove the handle of the laryngoscope she had palmed, solid steel, into the mercenary's brachial plexus. His arm went dead instantly. Before his rifle could hit the floor, she caught it by the strap, using the momentum to swing the stock into his jaw with a sickening crack. The other 2 mercenaries spun around, realizing too late that the threat wasn't the bodyguards. It was the woman in the blue scrubs. Ada didn't fire the rifle. That would draw too much attention. Instead, she used the environment. She kicked the rolling crash cart into the second gunman, the heavy metal drawers slamming into his knees and sending him sprawling. As he fell, she ripped a canister of ethanol spray from the counter and hurled it toward the third man, following it with the defibrillator paddle she had charged moments ago. "Clear," she whispered. She triggered the discharge. The spark ignited the ethanol mist in mid-air, creating a flash bang effect that blinded the gunman and set his tactical vest smoldering. He screamed, firing blindly into the ceiling. Sterling watched from under the desk, his mouth agape, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. The clumsy, trembling nurse who couldn't hold a tray was currently dismantling a hit squad with the efficiency of a machine. She moved with a fluid grace that was terrifying to behold, a dance of violence that made the hospital room look like a dojo. Jason watched too, propped up on one elbow, blood seeping through his bandages, but a smile touching his lips. He wasn't looking at a savior. he was looking at an equal. For the first time in years, the King of Soul felt a stir in his chest that had nothing to do with adrenaline. It was recognition. She was a monster, just like him, and she was magnificent. The fight was over in seconds. The three men lay groaning on the floor, neutralized by precise, non-lethal strikes to nerve clusters and joints. Ada stood over them, her chest barely heaving. She adjusted her scrub top, checking for blood splatter, then turned to the stunned room. The silence was heavier now than it had been when the guns were drawn. The residents, the nurses, Holloway, Sterling, they all stared at her as if she had just grown wings. The outsider mask had fallen completely. They saw the scars on her arms now, not as signs of clumsiness, but as a map of violence survived. They saw the stillness in her face, not as vacancy, but as discipline. Ada walked over to Sterling, who was trembling violently on the floor. She reached down and pulled him up by his lab coat, dusting him off with a sarcastic roughness. "Doctor," she said, her voice echoing in the silent room, "the threat is neutralized. The patient still needs surgery. Do I need to do that for you too, or can you handle a simple laparotomy?" Sterling couldn't speak. He just nodded, his arrogance completely evaporated, replaced by a primal fear. He would never look at her or any nurse the same way again. Ada turned back to Jason. The sirens were finally wailing in the distance. Real police, real questions. Her time here was done. Jason beckoned her closer. She stepped to the side of the stretcher. He reached into his jacket, which hung off the side of the bed, and pulled out a small blood-stained business card made of heavy black metal. He pressed it into her hand. His fingers lingered on hers, his skin hot against her cool palm. "St. Ives is too small for you," he murmured, his eyes logging onto hers with intense intimacy. "When you are tired of saving ungrateful sheep, come find the wolf." It was a job offer, a proposition, and a promise all wrapped in one. Ada looked at the card, then at him. A ghost of a smile, the first genuine emotion she had shown all night, touched her lips. "I'll think about it," she said softly, "but try not to get shot again. I charge extra for repeat customers." She turned and walked toward the exit, moving past the arriving SWAT team as if she were just another traumatized staff member. She slipped out the side door into the cool night air, stripping off the blue scrubs to reveal the tactical undershirt beneath. She didn't look back at the hospital. She didn't look back at the life she had just burned to the ground. Ada disappeared into the city, leaving behind a legend that would be whispered in the break room for years. The night the quiet nurse went to war, and the mafia boss saluted her for it. The tremor in her hand was gone. It had never been fear. It was just the engine idling, waiting for the green light, for the